Well, today, Steve Cortez is going to tell you or give you some ideas and some thoughts on what to do with that profit. So a long time, 20 plus years in the financial industries. Steve Cortez, you may see him regularly in the afternoons on a couple of CNBC shows. He's a regular on the Halftime Report and Closing Bell, commenting on all breadth and scope of financial wherewithal and items. But you may not know, 11 years ago in 2002, he formed his own consulting firm called Veracruz, and he consults with major companies and major funds all over the world, primarily trading, consulting, institutional research, market research. But if you study any of his works or if you've seen him on YouTube, he really keys in on two areas, China and Japan. And I think he's going to talk a little bit about both and the impacts that they have on world markets. And then he brings that home to what impact that has in the U.S. and on what's going on with your portfolios today. He talks about equities, fixed income, currencies. You may or may not know Steve's a graduate of Georgetown University. He played football there, and he was the George Baker Scholar at Georgetown. He resides in Chicago with his wife and 4 children. And today, he's going to talk to us about a book that he wrote, Against the Herd, 6 Contrarian Investment Strategies You Should Follow. These lead us to, in the preamble that I've read in it, a pretty healthy skepticism of the conventional market wisdom. So without further ado, on behalf of ServNet, and really on a bigger plan on behalf of the National Auto Auction Association, I thank Frank Hackett, who's the CEO of the National Auto Auction Association, of which ServNet Auctions are a member, to allow us to help present this speaker. It's really their sponsorship. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Cortez.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pierre, and thank you to ServNet and to the National Auto Auction Association. I am thrilled to be here at the CAR conference. Now, I will say, when I first looked at the agenda and I saw a 9 a.m. slot in Las Vegas, I said, wow, that's a tough one. That slot is a little bit like being the bartender at a Romney family reunion. It has the potential to be difficult and boring, but I don't think it's going to be. I'm hoping that you all have woken up and shaken the cobwebs off, and that you're ready to talk about financial markets and ready to talk about the world and what I see going on in the world and how it impacts you and your money and your businesses. Now, who here has the mentality of a teenager? Show of hands. I do at times. My wife would certainly say so. I wish I had the physical vitality of a teenager, and at times I have the mentality of a teenager. I would submit to you that the United States is a teenager. When I look at the United States economically, politically, even culturally, we have many of the characteristics, both positive and negative, of a teenager. On the one hand, we are full of energy and vitality, full of, at times, almost unbridled confidence and enthusiasm. But at the same time, we're incredibly self-doubting, very unsure of our power, insecure, and convinced in many ways that the future holds poorer days than the past. Well, I submit to you that, like a teenager, America as a nation is actually young and powerful and growing, and that our very best days lie ahead. If there's one thing on my channel, CNBC, or on Wall Street that is utterly unanimous in the opinion of the intelligentsia, it is that America is a power in decline. And the corollary, the flip side of that argument, is that China is a power who is rising and is the assured ascendant emerging superpower of the world. Well, I am here to tell you the truth, because unlike Colonel Jessup and A Few Good Men, I believe you can handle the truth. And the truth is that both of those theses are wrong. The United States is a power who is young and growing, and China is a very dangerous bubble. But before I get into the reasons why I see danger in China and why I continue to see very long-term opportunity in the United States, I'd like to talk a bit first about why be a contrarian. If you see me on television, you know that I am often at odds with my fellow broadcasters and panelists, all of whom seem to almost always agree with each other. I think that groupthink is a danger in all facets of life, but it is particularly a danger in the financial media and particularly a danger on Wall Street. By the way, I will tell you, so I'm on TV, as Pierre mentioned. It's not my full-time job, but I am on TV almost every day, and it definitely has its benefits. At times I get great tables at restaurants. At times I get recognized and pictures taken, and that can be a lot of fun. But there's also downside to it. I will tell you, last night here at Caesar's Palace, out of the casino, someone came up to me who apparently owns Apple. Apple happens to be a stock that I have pretty regularly trashed on air. And a very seemingly sweet older woman came up to me and said, "It's about time you stop picking on Apple, buddy," on air. So it does have its downsides being on television. You can be a bit notorious. My son also loves teasing me and loves telling his friends. He's a kindergartner. He loves telling his friends, "You know, my dad wears makeup almost every day." But on TV and in life, in investing, I often take the mindset and embrace the mindset of a contrarian. Now, why? The first most important reason for me is simply because the masses are so often wrong. And if we look at the history of financial markets, the bubbles that have ensued from the delusions of popular crowds, such as the Dutch tulip mania, which happened several centuries ago. At one point during Dutch tulip mania, single bulbs for tulips in Holland became worth more than the average house in Amsterdam. There was a South Sea bubble in Great Britain. We had Western Railroad bubbles here in the United States. And more recently, of course, I don't have to tell anybody about the dot-com bubble and the housing bubble. Now, I will tell you personally, other than just reading history, my epiphany moment in terms of embracing a contrarian mindset actually occurred in this very city. I was here about 20 years ago, and it was my first trip to Las Vegas. I put a bet in on a football game, and the entire sports book seemed to be rooting the other way against the team that I had bet on. Very, very late in the game, my team rallied to win and cover the spread. So I was very thrilled, and I went up to the teller to cash in my very meager bet, as I was just a young man. I'm not even 100% sure I was legal to be in the casino at that point, but we won't bother with the details there. But when I went to cash in my bet, looked over at the teller, who was an old, crotchety-looking man, and I said, "Wow, it seems like nobody had that game right." And he looked at me over his reading glasses. He was an old-school guy who had the visor on, and he said, "Son, I want you to always remember this. The masses are asses." And I said, "You know, it's true. And that's why they are the masses." So given that, I think we need to be very careful about seeing false safety in numbers. Safety in numbers is something that I think is very ingrained into our psyche, I think because of evolution. And while safety in numbers might have provided great protection in the wild against predators, it can in fact lead to very dangerous situations when it comes to groupthink and investing, particularly when you are assured by the so-called experts, whether they be in the financial media or on Wall Street or in government, that all is well. I will give you a quote from Ben Bernanke, not Alan Greenspan, from Ben Bernanke in July of 2007. He said, quote, "Given the fundamental factors in place that should support demand for housing, we believe the effect of troubles in the subprime sector on the broader housing market will be limited." That was just before the entire world financially started to fall apart. Following the herd into that morass of housing led to untold losses and pain, both financial and emotional, to literally millions of homeowners and investors all over the world. So I encourage you to think. It's the one-word motto of one of the most successful companies in history, IBM. Be skeptical. Judge the motives of those who are providing information for you, whether it's me, whether it's your broker, whether it's the financial media in general. You know much more than you think about financial markets, and Wall Street knows much less. I'll give you an example historically of the dangers of groupthink, a very tragic example. I'm from Chicago, and if I were to ask you what is the greatest human tragedy event in Chicago history, almost anyone, even a Chicagoan, would probably answer the Chicago fire. Cubs fans might answer it was the 1969 Cubs late season meltdown. But the Chicago fire, while it was incredibly destructive of property, it was not a great human casualty event, because the fire did burn very slowly and almost everyone got out of the way except for firemen. The greatest casualty event in Chicago history is, you've probably never heard of, it is the SS Eastland. It was a boat that was docked in the Chicago River to take workers from the Western Electric Company to a picnic on the shores of Lake Michigan over in Indiana. 2,000 people boarded the boat. There was some sort of disturbance on the side of the river. Everyone at once rushed to one side of the boat, tipping the entire SS Eastland over, trapping hundreds of men, women, and children underneath. A total of 844 people drowned. And they drowned in calm waters right next to shore at 20-foot depths. Now, from this terrible story, what is the takeaway? First, that following the herd can be very dangerous. But I think, secondly, it is important to note that often it is when we have our guard down that we are most susceptible to dangers that are unforeseen. And so because of that, I want to talk about what I think is the most dangerous present bubble in the world, and that is China. The main, let me back up for a second. The belief in China as the ascendant global power is almost unanimous, and it's from Wall Street all the way to Main Street. Gallup poll has done a poll every year for the last 5 years and asked regular Americans, what is the largest economy in the world? Every year, China's number has risen to the point where now, as of last year, 52% of Americans said that China is the largest economy in the world. Only 32% named the United States. In point of fact, the United States is 3 times larger than the economy of China. But the media and Wall Street have created a myth about China's importance already. Another poll that Gallup did in China, which I find very interesting, 60% of wealthy Chinese plan to leave China. So just as Americans mistakenly identify China as the world's largest economy, the Chinese wealthy are interested in leaving, and in fact leaving and sending their capital abroad as fast as they can. Now, what do I see as the chief danger of the China economy? It is the folly of central planning. The great Scottish economist Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, and in it he described the invisible hand of commerce, in which millions of self-interested actors align into efficient, innovative channels of commerce, and they achieve remarkable harmony. In contrast, he warned against the coercive and paradoxically inefficient idea of central planning. He recognized that no mortal and no small group of mortals can possibly successfully micromanage the economic affairs of a country. And yet, that is exactly what China is attempting to do. Hedge fund titan Jim Chanos, who you may have seen on my network CNBC, said, quote, Adam Smith is going to get his revenge in China. And in fact, I would caution those who embrace the China story that we have seen this movie before, and not that long ago. This was Japan in the 1980s. If you recall in the 1980s, how fearful the United States was of Japan. It seemed like it was an economically unstoppable force, buying everything in the United States from Rockefeller Center to Pebble Beach, exporting here, particularly in your industry, very successfully. And now we know that Japan has endured 2 lost decades of absolutely abysmal economic growth. Japan tried central planning, worked for a while, and then didn't, and I believe the same phenomenon is unfolding in China. A story related to Japan. I was, and because it's not just Main Street, I think, that is being fooled by the China story. I was at a hedge fund dinner in New York City. I was at the famous Sparks Steakhouse, and there were 6 of us there. And as we went around the table talking about market outlook, the praise for China was effusive. It turned out that of the 6 gentlemen there, I was the only one whose children were not taking Mandarin. When I suggested to them that in the United States it might be more useful for the children to take Spanish, I was met with polite dismissal. But it reminded me very much of the 1980s. In the 1980s, that same story would have been replayed with every child at that table taking Japanese. So we have seen that movie before. Now, the Communist Party of China, what kind of a task does it face? Well, it must manage the world's largest ever migration of people from west to east. It has to steer all industrial policy and allocate credit. And it has to stabilize inflation to placate the still impoverished masses of China. And so what has been the result of this Chinese central planning? The main result has been massive overbuilding, overinvestment, and overcapacity. China is a country right now that is full of airports that are unused, of bridges to nowhere, and of ghost cities. You might have seen 60 Minutes just this past Sunday had an entire story. Leslie Stahl went over and filmed some of the ghost cities in China, and they are frightening. They are cities literally built to house millions of people, and they stand utterly empty except for police forces and security guards. The most famous of them is Ordos, which I encourage you, if you're curious about this topic, to Google and look at some of the footage online of Ordos. This is the New South China Mall. It is in Dongguan. It is the largest mall in the entire world, 3,000 stores. It even has an almost full-size replica of the Arc de Triomphe inside. About the New South China Mall, the New York Times gushed, quote, "There is no end in sight and no evidence that China's long boom is likely to suffer anything more than a modest slowdown." Well, I submit that instead of no end in sight, there are no people in sight, because the New South China Mall sits 99% empty. Another fallout of central planning is the lack of innovation. China is a country as successful as it has been in recent years, and I concede that the growth in China has been magnificent in recent years. I don't think it's sustainable, but it has been magnificent. China as a country has failed to move up the value add chain into innovation. China so far is still a cut and paste economy, where it takes, and sometimes literally takes, sometimes steals, the innovations and designs of the West and produces them more cheaply using its labor advantages. I would question you, can you think of a single product, even though China is now the second largest economy in the world, can you think of a single product that has emanated from China, that truly came from China, that wasn't just copied from the West? Any? Fireworks? Okay. That's a good one. Anything more recent? I cannot, and that's astounding. That is really astounding. For instance, all right, your car folks, China is now the world's largest automobile producer. Yet, its contribution to auto design is negligible. Now, why? It's not because the Chinese aren't smart. If we look at international test scores, we certainly know that's not the case. It's because they have been lazy, the Chinese government, in relying only on a comparative wage advantage. And a wage advantage that, by the way, they are losing because wages are rising and they're starting to run out of workers, which I'll talk about in a second. So instead, they relied on the easy way out, cut and paste, and at times even steal. Some of you here, this is one of the few places left where you can still smoke. If some of you are smoking in Las Vegas, you might be using a Zippo lighter. Zippo makes 10 million lighters per year, and they are produced in the United States. They are guaranteed for life. Zippo's had a very significant problem, though, lately. China now also produces 10 million fake Zippos, which they call Rippos. If you send your Zippo into the company, they will replace it, lifetime guarantee. The company Zippo is now getting more fake Rippos sent in than real ones, because that's how massive Chinese counterfeiting is in their industry. And it's not just in simple things like lighters, it's also in complex things like software and aircraft. China is notorious for its lack of intellectual property protection. But the main reason they don't respect intellectual property is because they have so little of themselves to protect. Another reason that they are not innovating, the Chinese, is a culture of censorship. That fosters a culture of conformity and not creativity. Leonardo da Vinci did not invent under tyranny. I mentioned IBM earlier. Thomas Watson did not build IBM under the watchful eye of a big brother government, nor did Steve Jobs build Apple that way. And because of this stifling censorship in China and the real tyranny of its government, there is no equivalent to our HP garage. I would also point out that China has a significant population problem, only not the one you think. It is not too many people, but it is very soon too few. Because of the one-child policy, China is the fastest aging country in the world. Japan is the oldest country in the world, but China is on the same trajectory and right now actually at a faster clip. So I submit that China will grow old before it will grow rich. If we look at this slide, this is Chinese population growth. The line, which is descending, is the growth rate. And you can see from the upper left to the lower right that that line is crashing. Now, global population growth rates are coming down, to be sure. They're coming down here as well, but nowhere near to the degree in China because of the one-child policy. The bars on that chart are the total population of China, which is just about to crest. One interesting side note here, by the way, also because of the one-child policy, China has a gender mismatch of boys versus girls that is unseen anywhere else in the world. Now, I am unsure, to be honest, of the economic consequences of this gender mismatch, but I doubt very much that it will be good for the future of China to have a lot of unattached males, and that demographic bubble is just now working its way into the teenage years. And I believe that demographics is destiny. I think Japan showed us that. When I talked about Japan in the 1980s, the biggest warning that Japan's growth was unsustainable, I think, should have been the horrific demographics of Japan. Japan is a country now, by the way, with a funny but also sad characteristic. It's the only country in the world that sells more adult diapers than baby diapers. If demographics is destiny, and I believe it is, we know Japan is going to continue to descend, and I argue that China is on a similar trajectory. Now, the good book says, don't just curse the darkness, light a candle. So I want to light a candle and talk about my long-term belief in America and why I believe that our power is young and growing and why I believe there is going to be a second American century. The last century was very famously called the American century by Henry Luce, who was the founder and leader of Time magazine. Again, it's widely assumed, particularly within the media, within academia, that this century will be China's. And I argue forcefully that it will actually be America's century. And the first reason is demographics. Since I just talked about the poor demographics of Asia, let's talk about the wonderful demographics of the United States. I also believe that the United States will be dramatically helped by the energy boom that is unfolding right now. And then lastly, I'll talk about the culture of innovation and creativity that fosters growth in the United States. This graph, I think more than anything else, argues for the continued dominance of the United States. This is young workers. This is workers aged 15 to 64 growth rate. China is in the red. This is started in the year 2000. Europe is in the yellow, and the United States is in the green. As you can see, Europe has already started to descend in terms of the numbers of workers. China is just about to crest. But the United States, because of a higher birth rate and because of massive immigration, will continue to grow with young workers far into the future. And folks, I submit to you that the world belongs to the young. I don't feel that young necessarily anymore, but in economics, the world belongs to the young. If demographics is destiny, then this chart tells me that the United States, with young workers, is going to continue to thrive and outperform the rest of the world. I mentioned immigration, and that is a key point in favor of the United States. While immigration is at times a controversial political subject, I think economically its benefits are uncontestable. What immigrants bring to the United States in terms of their knowledge, their enthusiasm, their hard work, their reproduction, as we see on these charts, places the United States in a singular position. I think at times as Americans, we don't realize, we don't fully appreciate the singularity of the United States. We are literally the only industrial country in the world with a growing population. And that is because we're having babies at a far higher rate than the rest of the industrial world, and we have immigration which is far beyond any other country in the world. By the way, China, for all the talk and euphoria about China, there is no queue of folks waiting to get into China. Quite the opposite. There is still a queue waiting to come to the United States, and much to our benefit. For instance, last year, 50% of all patents that were granted in the United States were granted to foreign-born citizens. Right now, in the United States, 80% of all graduate-level math students are international. And also last year, the Intel Student Science Search, which is probably the most prestigious high school science competition in the country. 7 of the 10 winners last year were the children of immigrants. So I submit to you that from the laborers who are sweating in produce fields all the way to the graduate labs at Stanford University, America benefits mightily from immigration. And because of population growth, I believe America's future is very secure. Now, another issue is the energy boom. And this is something, frankly, which I think very few people saw coming until very recently. This chart is Texas oil production, going all the way back into the 1980s. And if you look at that chart, you don't see many charts that go parabolic like this. So slowly descending for years, for decades, right? Oil production in the United States was very challenged. The easy oil had been extracted, environmental regulations were increasing, and we were becoming more and more dependent on foreign oil. We are seeing the exact flip side now of all of that. Because of technology, because of fracking, because of what's going on in western Pennsylvania, in Texas, in North Dakota, U.S. oil production is absolutely soaring. Now, I believe that this will lead, this energy bonanza, and more so actually natural gas than crude oil. I believe that this energy bonanza, which will provide the United States with secure, domestic, cheap energy, is going to lead to an absolute renaissance of American manufacturing. We're already starting to see it to some degree. When you reduce those input costs for factories, particularly ones who are able to harness natural gas, which now trades at a fraction of where it traded just a few years ago. When you reduce those input costs into those factories, even with higher wages, the United States becomes instantly competitive with even emerging markets like China. When you factor in higher U.S. productivity with incredibly low energy, that is the recipe for an end to offshoring and the beginning of onshoring, which I believe we are already starting to see. So given charts like this, I think we need to do a remake of the Beverly Hillbillies because it's happening again. People are getting incredibly rich. Farmers in the middle of nowhere in West Virginia, in Western PA, folks who hold leases in Texas. There is an energy boom going on right now. And I believe the effects from this boom will be felt for years and decades to come. And it is a massively bullish U.S. story. And by the way, I keep picking on China. China is in the exact opposite situation. China is increasingly reliant on the Middle East for its oil. So while we become ever more self-sufficient, and I believe have a future of secure and cheap energy, China and much of the world faces the exact opposite. They're increasingly dependent on the Middle East on a very hot and contested area. And by the way, an area where they have no ability to project power. While we were dependent on the Middle East for oil, we at least did have the military that could protect that flow of oil. China has no such military at present. The culture of prosperity is also incredibly important. Now you might be saying, what is this picture? Can you recognize the guy in the lower left? It's Bill Gates. How about the lower right? Anybody know? Paul Allen. That is Bill Gates and Paul Allen. And that is the founding team of Microsoft. Bill Gates was 20 years old. Now, why do I show you this goofy picture other than just to get a good laugh at the beards and the outfits and the fact that Bill Gates looks not 20, he looks like he's 8 when he founded Microsoft? It is because I think it exemplifies America's culture of innovation and of tinkering. The fact that Bill Gates left Harvard to start Microsoft speaks books and volumes about the United States as a country. That is a story which would not happen even in Europe. It certainly would not happen in China. If a young Chinese man gained entry to the most prestigious university in China, he would not fathom leaving that university on a whim, on an idea to start a company. And furthermore, he couldn't start that company anyway unless he had political connections. He would have to be wired into the Communist Party to try to start a company at all. And in Bill Gates' case, without any political connections, with just fantastic ideas and tremendous drive, he was able to start Microsoft. Any country that will trust a kid who looks like that with capital to start a company is clearly a country that believes in risk-taking and a country that believes in innovation. Now, given my future outlook for the United States and for China, how do we invest? What do you do with your hard-earned money from the auto business in financial markets? Well, first let me state that I'm no Pollyanna about the United States. We certainly face tremendous risks at present. Most of them, I believe, government invented. High taxes, rising regulation, and our population growth, while far superior to the rest of the world, is slowing. So there are risks to the United States. But the chief risk to the United States, I don't believe, is domestic or internal. It is external. It's the fact that, unfortunately, America has invested so heavily in China. And so if I am right about the impending bursting of the bubble in China, we are going to see some significant pain in U.S. financial markets as well. So what is my strategy? I think you need to focus on 2 Ds, dividends and domesticity. First, dividends. In this era of low global growth, interest rates have stayed incredibly low. As you may know, the 10-year yield now is under 2%. People look at that and say to return less than 2% in a risk-free manner is not terribly exciting, and I agree with you, it isn't. But I also believe that those interest rates are going to stay low for a very long time. And if that is the case, then dividend-paying stocks represent tremendous value here. I also, because of my fears of China and the emerging market bubble, want to stay domestic. So I love domestic names. I think focusing on the United States as an investor will pay handsomely in the future. There are companies that meet both of these criteria very well, and they are utilities. I love utilities that pay a handsome dividend, typically 4, 5, even 6%, depending on which company you choose, and utilities are almost by definition domestic. We export very little energy. So they are U.S. concerns. Now, I know that's not glamorous, it's not sexy, but I think it is effective. And I think boring is beautiful in investing. And although the markets have done incredibly well, the Dow Jones hit an all-time record just this week, although financial markets have done incredibly well, I do think that Wall Street and America right now is being a bit blind and a bit cavalier about the risks of China. And if that is the case, I think you want to be in a defensive strategy that is focused on dividends and domestic businesses. And I am going to take Q&A, but first, before that, I want to just tell you that thank you for having me very much, and I think that you need to mentally prepare, think, be skeptical, and prepare for the second American century. Because I believe economically and otherwise that Ronald Reagan was correct in his final speech as president when he told us, quote, whether we seek it or not, whether we like it or not, we Americans are the keepers of the miracles. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.